We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Forest Product Society monthly webinar series, Forest Product Insights. Each month, this series will welcome a guest and speaker sharing their research, technical expertise, and experience to a live audience. The series takes place on the third Wednesday of each month and will feature new guest speakers from various industry areas. We mean this to be an open conversation where your questions can be answered and ideas can be shared amongst peers within the forest product sector. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat box, and we'll have time at the conclusion of the presentation for oral questions as well. If you're not an FPS member, we also invite you to learn more about FPS and consider membership in our organization. Today's speakers are Justin Price from Evergreen Engineering and Adrian Pirraglia from Corning Optical Communications. We've all heard of the Industrial Revolution, which was driven by the use of steam and water power equipment, the beginning of mechanization. But have you heard of the fourth Industrial Revolution? Industry 4.0 will shape the worldwide economics as programs and projects are being implemented all around the world, focusing on helping people take advantage of the marvels of the fourth Industrial Revolution. Today, Justin and Adrian will take a closer look at how we find ourselves in the midst of this revolution, Industry 4.0, and discuss the risks and challenges specific to the wood products industry, highlighting how other industries have embraced this new revolution. They'll also demonstrate how some industries have implemented Industry 4.0 and achieved production increases, reduction in maintenance costs, and downtime. So that, Justin and Adrian, will turn it over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Chris. Really excited to have everyone here today, and just excited to start talking about the Industry 4.0 within the wood products. I know it's sort of a buzzword within what we do here at Evergreen. And I first want to thank Adrian again for being with us. He comes to us. He does have some forestry background. Some of you may know him from his days in the wood products. He has moved over and working in a different industry, so he has a lot of great experience in both the wood products and other industries to talk about how this is moving into our various manufacturing sectors.
Thank you for having me.
I really want to keep this open as more of a panel discussion than anything. You know, I really encourage everyone to sort of speak up, put their questions in the chat box, and Chris is going to be monitoring that to make sure we address any of those questions. And as we talk through it, I've kind of put together this sort of overall agenda, if you would, sort of what we want to talk about, and sort of just help Adrian and I focus our conversations. And Adrian and I have spent a lot of time talking about just where do we see the industry going in terms of technologies, and what does this Industry 4.0 really mean to what we do. So sort of an overview, where are we? Then what is it? I'm sure there's a lot of questions around what it is and how did we get here, and then just the history and the future trends of where we're headed with it. And then sort of really addressing that roadmap. We'll talk a bit about how it really starts with the maintenance programs and how it builds up from there and then throughout your organization. And with that, we'll talk about some of the main areas of focus. And then we'll sort of wrap it up and sort of conclusions, next steps, and thoughts. Obviously, as we go through these slides, feel free again just to reach out and talk with us a bit. So I'll touch on this a little bit, and since, you know, I'll talk a lot about the forest products, is what I see, and Adrian, I welcome your comments as we move through this, and then we'll just sort of go from there and just have a dialogue back and forth. So, I mean, you guys can relate to this, those that are in the industry and those that are doing research in the mills and things of that nature. A lot of the operations that we work with today in the industry are sort of at the end of life. They were built 20, 30, 40 years ago. Those or sort of now you've got to think about replacing those assets or upgrading those assets. Traditional products, of course, are being replaced. Obvious examples there are, you know, plywood versus OSB. Structural timber, CLT is coming on the market. So those are some of those things we see within the wood products area. That's sort of where the wood products industry is. And then, of course, over these past years, we've seen a large number of new facilities being built. So I can think of several facilities that have come online in the past years between MDF, just a bunch of facilities that are coming into the marketplace. Lots of new sawmills, lots of new operations, and so they have sort of this different stage of their life. So we have to balance some old assets and new assets. Adrian, how does that compare to what you see outside of the wood products industry?
Uh, it is a bit different because many of the processes in the forest industry are very large, while some other industries are more manufacturing cells. And replacing manufacturing cells within a facility or putting up a new line is much easier, much simpler, much faster than it is for the forest product industry. That was my first shock when switching industries recently, seeing how quickly they can come up with new technology and just put it in place, make it operational, turn it to ops, and start production. Here, for the majority of our of forest products or wood products related industries, it's one very large process. Replacing a furnace is extremely difficult. Replacing a press is extremely difficult. Replacing a sawing system is usually very complex. So that's the main difference I have seen. So these industries are much faster to adapt to these changes simply because they're more modular.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I've seen that in all the industries we work with, just in Evergreen. And you think about, like, you're making in the forest products, if you think about the tissue lines, right? So to make the tissue itself on the big paper handling rolls is one side of that. And then if you think about the secondary manufacturing of the toilet paper rolls, right? Those tend to be in that cell modulation. So that back end of a tissue mill, um,
Yep.
much more modular, much more easy to replace those individual cells, as you talk about. And I've seen that as well too. That's a great analogy of that.
Mhm.
So what is Industry 4.0? And I'll talk a bit about this, but Adrian, I want to hear from you on how do you think this is really going to change the world? What is it?
Well, to me, Industry 4.0 is that integration of data, which we've had for a while, but bringing in the artificial intelligence and the machine learning aspect to it, machinery and communication, and creating that specific kind of an industrial ecosystem, that interaction, human machine, that changes from just pushing buttons to actually learning,
Mhm.
understanding, and making changes on the fly, helping the operator as it's processing material.
Yeah. So how
That
many?
that's the basic of
Yeah.
industry.
So I think the key things to me, that as I started digging into Industry 4.0 and how have we implemented it into wood products, is there's a couple of things that really classifies when you start moving into that Industry 4.0. And I saw it firsthand in the lumber mills some years ago when we started putting in automatic grading machines. That was sort of the early deal, right? So now we have a machine in there doing automatic grading, but that's really sort of that industry, we'll say 3.5, if you would. So industry 3.0 was really the adaptation of computing power into the operations. And now when you can start having those machines making decisions for you within the operation, with an operator there to sort of make sure the machine is operating in real time. But I really think that's not necessarily 4.0. It's just the automatic grader. It's when we started putting in systems that would learn from the mistakes in grading. To
Correct.
me, that's where you really start moving into that Industry 4.0. And I know it's funny to think about it, but really it's the Internet of Things, or the Internet of Systems, as we start talking about, like, your Alexa smartphones or device in your home and how everything is interconnected. And it's like, think about your
Correct.
mill, and all of these systems now are starting to talk together and work together and sort of adjusting process parameters to match speeds and things of that nature. To me, that's when you start moving into that Industry 4.0.
Correct. And one of the main issues now that you make the analogy with Alexa and with our current cell phones is, well, before you had data that was mostly static. You ran a statistical process control project, got the data, got the results, implemented, done. And right now you're looking into systems that continually keep looking at that information, adding more data, creating models that actually keep updating themselves and changing the outcomes. So that's a fundamental change of perception and how we do things. And it helps a lot with aging population in the workforce, that they take their knowledge with them. And even when you switch jobs, previously a lot of people will, spend 30 years in a company, and now that's fairly rare to see. So all of that knowledge is constantly changing and constantly being lost. And having the Internet of Things, having cloud computing integrated, it allows you to save that information there. So you see it when you save on your Facebook, you save pictures there, and 4 years, 5 years after that, it reminds you of, hey, I did this 5 years ago. Here's what you did at what time, and how you did it, and how you enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, right? As we start thinking about, particularly in operations, like SKUs, we're going to run a SKU of a product, and the machines can then hold on to that data and then be able, to your point, hey, last time we ran this, we had it set here. Are you sure you want that set point changed off of that? Or,
Correct.
Those sorts of things are really, when you think about it. And that's that sort of that last bullet point, the smart factory. To think about, like you said, data to date, or in Industry 3.0, was really static. It was held onto, and then doing something with that data required a human to come in and collect it and manage and continue to operate within that work of the parameters of the data. And now I think we start to see how the computers, Google, for example, talk about an AI company, that's really what they are. So yeah, that's, to me, what Industry 4.0 is. Just to open up to the audience, what are you guys seeing in the industry? We talked about a couple of things. I'd love to hear some examples of maybe what you guys are seeing, if there's some industry people, or maybe there's some professors or university settings where you guys are starting to look at how the AI is going to affect manufacturing operations. So I thought I'd put this slide together just to sort of give some history of it, right? Adrian and I have been talking about where Industry 4.0 is and what it is. And this is sort of a timeline of it. We've talked about where we see it at today in the wood product industry, but this sort of, as Chris alluded to, the industry revolution really started with steam power, mechanical power, right? If you think about the old, the man versus Paul Bunyan, and him versus our Big John versus the steam hammer, some of that early industrial revolution and the legacies that we had there of moving out of that. And that was really the first industrial revolution. And then as the industry came along, then we really got to this second industrial revolution where we start thinking about, Henry Ford and his mass production of using the machines now to really move industry along. And that really became the first assembly lines and those sorts of things. And that was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And that lasted all the way up until the late 60s, early 70s, when computing power started to happen. And that's when sort of that third revolution, where we now started getting insight into our process. All the data becomes available to us. PLCs start to be available, home computing. And now we're looking at where we are today in the early 2000s or mid 2000s or whatever, of combining all of that. And I think the other side of that is the dots along the lines of that far right-hand screen is complexity, right? If you think back to early machines, those machines were pretty simple, pretty robust. And you can go to, I know where I live in Eugene, Oregon, there's a steam-powered plant still cutting lumber, Whole Oaks Lumber Company there. And it's an architectural marvel, mechanical marvel to watch that operation, but it's not very complex. Now, when we get into some of the modern technologies of, some of these operations, and like we're talking about on the backside of a paper mill, where you're changing out, cells of machines that are operating at very high capacity and high speed, that complexity that they're dealing with is very, very high. And now you're adding information on top of that and managing that information. So it's that, as we've progressed through time, we've gotten much, much more complicated in those systems. Again, just another sort of pictorial. We're entering it now, and hopefully that's another visual for you guys. Adrian, anything you want to add to any of those things that I sort of didn't touch on?
I would just add that the word complexity should not be scary for us. We're not kind of asking anyone who works in the facilities to become a programmer right now overnight and gain those skills. The work complexity is just everything that goes behind the scenes now that makes all that information that we were not able to grasp before, it makes it digestible for us. It
Yeah.
kind of gives us a roadmap or a way for us to make decisions and to make future decisions and understand what's happening and find root causes that otherwise would have escaped us.
And that's a great point too. I think when we talk about how we move into that, Adrian, when we talk about like the complexity, and you say, well, I've got operators and now they need to become programmers. So not really, because that's the beauty of where we are. I think there's technologies that are sort of in software packages and other things that get implemented that really make it like that visual into it, right? So we have all this data. How do we visualize it? And how do we help make decisions? I think you're absolutely right. That's a very good point. I really like that. There's a lot of complexity behind the scenes, but the user interface is sort of like, if you think about the computer, here we are on a Zoom call. The technology that got us here was pretty doggone complex, from the things you're doing with, communication, optic cabling and things, to Wi-Fi systems, to laptops, to networks. But yet all we did was, for me, is click a link, and next thing you know, Jennifer let me into the presentation. So pretty easy on my part, but there's a whole lot that goes in the background of that too. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great point. We appreciate that. So let's talk about some of these risks. Adrian, why don't you walk us through some of these risks and challenges that you think we are faced with?
Well, what I've seen in my short career in the forest products industry is, as you mentioned before, aging equipment, new facilities coming up at an unprecedented pace, and the complexity of the projects has just skyrocketed. So there are so many aspects. Now we have so many tools that are supposed to make our life easier, but we have to connect the dots correctly to make them work. And there's some sort of lack of preparedness that I've seen in the industry for these highly automated systems. It seems like there was some lack of belief in that this will catch on and that this will become something that will dictate our future, and it turns into a highly increased risk of failing at these large projects. As I pointed out before as well, there's a factor of an aging population and change in the way we work. We've seen it with the pandemic. A year ago, this caught us completely off guard, and how much of this, the issues with pricing that we're seeing, the issues with availability of lumber and other materials like sensors and chips, how much of that could have been avoided had we had some of these systems in place, so that remote work, remote monitoring, and remote changes would have been possible.
Mm-hmm.
Just think about that. Right now we're seeing this whiplash effect in which the supply chain is completely disrupted at this point, and we're trying to get it back on track. But how much of this could have been avoided with more preparedness to the complexity of Industry 4.0 and how we can monitor and make changes to equipment remotely?
Yeah, I just want to I'm going to use a computer term here. Let's just double click on that for a second and dig into that conversation a little bit, right? So what I see is our industry is a heavy industry, and we have to be very present within that operation, right? So we have to be there to see, and I'm gonna go back to our analogy of grading lumber. Well, I have to be there as a lumber grader to put my hands on the lumber, to flip it both sides, and do a visual grading of that. Our operations in wood products, our individuals, our team members within that organization, our facilities are set up so that they have to be present inside that. Whereas we look at what we're doing in terms of remote work and remote systems, I mean, we're scattered all over the US and maybe abroad today, and we're here all together collaborating on this webinar. So as we think about where we are today in the wood products and how pandemic has forced us to really move into this technologies of remote work, even, I think we have to think in terms of how do we build these factories, these smart factories, to allow for more remote work of employees in terms of not having to be there. To take your point, like the pandemic hit, if industries that are able to operate in a more remote work setting, they can accelerate and maintain their productions through things like this, as well as moving forward, versus a very hands-on operation. What are your thoughts on that, Adrian?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. The forest products in general is a very present industry. You need the operators there. And one of the issues is, well, as soon as this pandemic hit, you get a combination of you have people trained in just one area, usually, and that person cannot be present, so you have to shut down instead of being able to operate with half of your personnel on site, half of your personnel remote, being able to have that social distancing that will allow you to safely operate within the parameters of what we're living through today, and understanding that we might be dealing with this for years to come. There might be small focalized waves of the virus somewhere in some areas, and some of these factories will suffer that. So adapting to that half remote, half present could be key for near-term success.
Absolutely. So we sort of touched on some of these the struggles and sort of where we are, and these are some of the data, Adrian, that we had pulled together. And I just want to sort of go through these at a high level, and just sort of for emphasis of time, I don't want to spend too long talking about where how bad the industry is, but hopefully we can start to highlight where we see, at least for me and from my perspective, of the work we see happening and where we see the forest industry moving, and just putting some food for thought out there, right? So, if we talk about doing this, like moving into that, we have to recognize that this digital transformation, 84% of these projects tend to fail. So this is not something easy to just, let's go buy a piece of software and put it in and the world's happy-go-lucky. There's some real risk there. 30% of respondents struggle with this data management. And that's like, now I've got all this data, I can't see what I want to see. So it really takes some insight. I think really what I want to just highlight in all of this is it's that commitment. It's not a one and done when you implement these programs. I think you really have to have someone there in your organization who embraces it and then can spread that through the organization as part of the culture of it as well.
Correct. And back to your question on where we see an area that will definitely positively influence our industry. That definitely will be maintenance, and that's why maintenance is mentioned on this presentation so often, and it's because we have had quality data for quite some time. We know all the mechanisms to analyze that data. We have done it with supply chain fairly well. But maintenance seems to have been left behind. And when you look at the costs of maintenance, and I see it on the chat that someone pointed out, well, the industry is very reactive. We're always constantly firefighting, constantly just fixing, just hands-on fixing. And that's the cost of maintenance. And going from corrective to predictive maintenance, which is what having this data, this digital transformation with good information, that's the half of or that's a reduction to about half as much as you were paying for your corrective maintenance. So it is an area that is primed for implementing Industry 4.0. We got to bring it up to that level.
I think this, and we'll talk a bit about this, is that 25% production increase with that 30% reduction in maintenance costs, that's right there. I see it all the time. When you can move a culture out of the firefighting, like just reactive every day, into more preventative and planning is step one. Now, as you start to move out of that, once you get good, robust systems in the predictive maintenance systems and building that predictive maintenance systems, that's step one. Now you're starting to get the data from that. Now you can start applying the technologies into that data.
Correct, and that plays a big part. I think in previous years, we've had a lot of failure mode data that has been faulty at best, and you know, garbage in, garbage out. If you have data that doesn't really work, well, your digital transformation will definitely fail. So having that baseline in which you can move on to predictive maintenance based on solid and sound information is key. It's critical, and that's where that reduction in maintenance time and increase in productivity will come from.
Yeah, and this is sort of the opportunity. I want to just sort of talk a bit about that. How does this really happen? And you know, I go back to the days when I worked in the mills, is when we would roll out these programs and we'd start getting our maintenance guys involved, and we started getting into this predictive level, right? And so what we started to do on these things is say, okay, well, I've got a cylinder, for example, and we know that it constantly breaks, and we never know when it's going to break, and it breaks down in the middle of the production, and we have to get in there and replace the cylinder. And what we started to do is then put some trending on that. Like, okay, well, let's just collect some data. And what we found is after X so many strokes of that cylinder is you would have a pin failure. And oh, that failure kept happening. And so then we beefed up the pin, and then we got longer lives. And then we started thinking bigger picture of like, well, why don't we just start changing that pin out, you know, before the failure during a maintenance period, right? And so that's step one to me. And the next step of that would be, well, do I always need that same pressure on that cylinder to move it or make its position happen, which reduces the forces on it, right? And so now we can start really thinking intellectually about what that mechanism is doing. And that's when you start getting into that Industry 4.0. Moving on, Adrian, let's talk a bit about what the opportunity is. Where do we see in the forest products and paper industry? This is out of some data that we pulled. Maybe you can talk a bit about what we're seeing here and the benefits of it.
Well, where I see and I mentioned this, where I see the opportunity, of course, is in maintenance and predictive maintenance in particular. But where I see the biggest issue and the biggest opportunity for us, or the lowest hanging fruit, is what do we have in our facilities currently? So, Justin, you've been you know, you've been acting as a project manager, project engineer for a number of years, and you probably designed several facilities and several pieces of equipment that you've gone back to them 5-6 years later. And when you look at the drawing that you originally created and what's actually functioning at that time, and it's just two completely different things.
Not on the Evergreens designs, others.
Right.
Let's just make
Right. Well, that's because of the facilities will make changes, and changes are not documented. Changes are not kept in good control. There's parts obsolescence, which is a huge issue. And many times when you create these systems and some parts or some things don't quite work, or the need has changed for that piece of equipment, that is not very well documented after you have those drawings and after you have that equipment installed, up and running, and it's turned to maintenance. So keeping that database, that baseline of all the parts, all the drawings, everything that pertains to that particular piece of equipment, how to disassemble it, how to troubleshoot it, and just keeping that up to date is the baseline for everything else. Especially, I mean, if I could ask everyone here present today, you know, how many times have you had a failure and come to realize that the part you're looking for has been obsolete for 10 years? You can't find that anymore, and now you're struggling to modify the whole equipment because you can't find it, and it's going to take you 3 weeks to get that part, right?
Yeah. I have a very specific incident of that. Is recently I was in a metals manufacturing. I know it's not wood products, but it was a forging operation, In this forging operation, it would take the big ingot, and it's a hot billet that's some distance long and fairly large. It was probably, I don't know, 2 meters in diameter, and of course it's red hot, molten. And the arm had to grab the ingot and draw it across the forge, and so it would move on a track, and then it would move back. Well, the facility was put in 1940s or something during World War II, and so of course this machine was, not only was it obsolete, but the company that made it was obsolete, and so it's, and you see that in industry as well. And I think that's where we talk about, like, this slide here, this $2.8 billion year was moving into that, right? So as we move these assets into that, there's a lot of opportunity to really gain in those operations. So.
Correct, and it's a lot of legwork for current and existing facilities to get that data, to get accuracy on what they actually have in the plant. But it makes a whole difference. It makes an incredible difference when you know exactly, hey, this part failed and this part was made by this manufacturer and it's on this diagram and this is the installation and changeover procedure. And if the part is obsolete, that's where Internet of Things and some other systems will come on and will tell you, hey, this part is obsolete, but there's a replacement part, a higher grade, a different part that you can adapt to this, giving you that accessibility to things that we currently don't have.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about the maintenance, we've talked a lot about data collection, and I wanted to sort of put this into perspective, if we can, and sort of what does this look like, right? And so really these are sort of there's 3 main areas that really come down into one centralized section. We talk about in maintenance, like the hierarchy of equipment and what's critical, like Adrian just mentioned. This bearing is very critical to our operation. This is the part number. We got to make sure we stay on top of those. The next area of that is sort of like, what are our KPIs? How is this supposed to operate? As an operation, we need to know when we're at our rate that we need to be when we're running. We didn't know where we are compared to that. Those are all the KPIs that we know, and we've done a lot of those in the quality side, as you mentioned, but we also need to recognize that from a maintenance KPI as well.
Correct.
And then we move into the storeroom and the parts management, right? As you said, now we've got this big storeroom, and how do we automate that? How do we bring that together? But really, I think it goes back to that team, that structure, and the development of those teams and structures within your organization. I think it's how this slide to me is really sort of the inputs and the outputs of an Industry 4.0.
Yes, absolutely.
So what does this look like? So obviously we want to talk about a well-structured management hierarchy, right? So as you build those systems, how does this look like in the maintenance programs? This is what I typically would see in a maintenance type operations within those. Adrian, how does that compare to what you see in what you're doing in your current operations? That's an optical type systems and not necessarily wood products.
You will see a lot more emphasis on controls. Having cellular or modular manufacturing, it requires it. You have 10, 15, I don't know, 20 times more sensors per square foot than you will have in the forest products industry, probably. So there's a lot more integration with controls. It's not only electrical and mechanical and reliability. It's also the controls part, and they focus a lot on feedback loops and trying to understand how changes upstream will influence the variables or these KPIs we're measuring downstream. And if we're seeing an issue, how can we either prevent it from complete failure while we find a replacement part, or stop it on time so that the failure is preventable altogether. So there's a lot more emphasis on controls.
Yeah, and I think you're right, though. I think each of those organizations will have these 4 main items, but to what you're talking about is really how all 4 of those things really sort of blend together in that. That's a great point. So let's talk about that.
Another important aspect
Oh.
here is, while being
We'll skip over. I forgot to take off some volume of that one.
Let's talk a little bit about storeroom and parts management.
Hang on one second. I gotta. Apologize for that. Adrian and I had been recording some things, and I forgot to.
Not a problem.
Hey, Justin, while you're resetting, I'm gonna throw out this first question that we had. Scott Levengood said he'd heard it. So in Industry 4.0 described as increasing the amount of useful information we get from all the data being collected. I would add to that, does it also mean that we're going to try to weed out some of the less useful information that we get?
Go ahead,
I
Justin.
was going to say, why don't you answer that one for us?
I will say yes. You weed out some of that information that is not useful, but it is not eliminating it from your systems. You never know at what point that information could become useful. So at some point, I mean, storage capacity at this point is not a big issue, especially when you're talking about cloud computing. And you know, the current processing power of your equipment has, you know, skyrocketed. So it is not just eliminating it, it's you keep it there, and you make your equipment and your softwares as well learn from it and determine at some point, you know what, after 1,000 iterations or after 10,000 hours, well, you know, I've been finding that this particular piece of information accounts or could be you know, about 5% of our failures. Just a very general example. It might not be a significant amount when you're comparing it with, you know, something that will be 20% of your failures, but at some point it could become extremely useful.
Yeah, I kind of think about it like Google searches, right? And Google tracks every search within, and at the end of the year, they always say the most searched word in that state or that region, or the most misspelled word in the searches. And they have all these this anecdotal, sort of, not anecdotal, but these sort of off the wall things they throw out there. And that means they're collecting everything, and you don't really know if the word, you know, cat and dog video is going to be the most searched term in your region until you get to the end of the year and you have all the data. And so if you don't capture all the data, you don't really know. But I think what Scott's really alluding to is being able to look at all of the data and filter out what rises to the top. And yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And to your point is you don't want to lose the other data, because at some point, maybe it's not year one, but year two, maybe it rises to the top at that point. Right.
Correct.
That's a great point, Scott. I appreciate the question. So jumping back into the presentation here, hopefully that's sharing again. I appreciate that, the pause there, but really wanted to talk about the structure and the development of your teams. And I guess really the highlight to this one is it's not and just go buy the software and put it in. I think it's a lot about that continuing training culture is what I see it as. I think back to it's sort of an old cliche is when I walk into a facility, I kind of know if it's a good facility or a bad facility just based upon the housekeeping. When I walk into a wood products operation and it's, you know, dust issues and spillage out of conveyors and, you know, all of these other sorts of appearance issues within their operation, it really shows that they're focused on their operation, maintaining their assets. Those tend to be A, the safest plants in operations, and B, the most productive plants in operation. So there's a lot just to be said, and that's a cultural thing. And I think this really highlights that. It's about the team and developing that culture around that and implementing it. And again, to what we were talking about earlier, is really knowing what you're looking at from that data, and then having the systems in place to really help start developing the AI and really moving you into that. We do have to avoid some things, the hero syndrome, right? Creating this skill matrix for tasks, and those are some things that we got to be focused on. So. Let's talk a bit about the storeroom and part management setup behind the scenes. Adrian, tell me a little more about what you see happening with these systems.
Well, what I've seen in many forest products facilities is the difficulty in finding parts and understanding through this integration of systems, hey, if this bearing failed, where do I have it or where can I procure it? Do I have long-term contracts with my suppliers so that they stock it and I'm not paying for having it on site, especially if it's a high value part. But I have it available within, an hour or within a few minutes. And just understanding that ties back to what I mentioned on that baseline information you need to have up to date, going back to your drawings, going back to your BOMs, your bill of materials, your part list. Understanding all of those and having in place a good supplier contract that will allow you to quickly respond to your part changes. That's extremely critical.
So we'll talk a little bit about the hierarchy of that system, right? So you have your parts list, your bill of materials and things of that nature. And this is really how that gets implemented, right? You have, for example, a bearing.
Yes.
And then you know what equipment that's on or sub-equipment that's on, which is sort of the next step up in that. And then you know what its primary uses are, right? Like its business categories and things like that. How do we manage that? Talk me through a little bit what we're seeing on this hierarchy.
Well, basically what we see in the industry very, very often is the base of the pyramid. We see that we understand what the part is, we understand it's a bearing, we maybe understand the part number, we understand where it goes. But then as we start going up this pyramid, we start losing traceability of, well, which subunit, which equipment unit, is this part current? Can we procure it quickly? And all of that plays into how quickly you can respond to issues. I will say that for these items, it is extremely it's extremely important to have all the components working together in unison at some point, especially when you understand the criticality of your equipment. If it's not a critical equipment, well, that's not your number one pillar, the one that sustains the whole house. But you can have some flexibility on those, but definitely on those critical elements, you want to have that complete pyramid of hierarchy there.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about a few KPIs. And in this, it's KPIs are a couple of dashboards here, and you talk about the asset utilization models and things of that nature. And this is really geared towards that machine and hows, right? So this is really the how you move into it once you understand the KPIs, right? Is that sort of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, and also understanding and having your systems programmed in a way to understand, hey, which are leading and which are lagging indicators, which ones I'm going to see, after the failure or after the change, and which ones I'm seeing as a symptom of something that it's currently happening. And this ties back to, can I predict that? If I can predict that, and if I tie it back to my storeroom and to my suppliers, can I understand that next week I'm going to need that bearing from this supplier, so I better get it ordered now because it's coming from the other side of the country.
Mm-hmm.
So that integration is critical. And depending on which supplier you have, they currently have integration software and systems in place to provide you with that service, and they will understand, they will get notified probably before you do that this part is about to fail. I've seen a lot of, and bearings is a great example, I've seen a lot of softwares telling you exactly the failure mode and when it's going to fail that bearing, having that sensor right there, and it will give you that indication, and it will alert your supplier, and it will tell you, hey, this supplier has 2 of them in stock. So
Yeah,
that complete integration is critical.
Yeah, I see it played out in a lot of other industries, more so than the wood products industry, right? So if I think
Yes,
a lot of e-commerce is exactly this, right? So they can trend and track when things move in and out of storerooms, and they can track inventories, and they say, oh, well, we just had a run on toilet paper. We should probably go order more toilet paper.
correct.
Just by the time they move it from the warehouse, crossing through a scanner to go put it out on the floor. That triggers the information out of the warehouse and storing of, hey, we've just moved 5 crates of toilet paper out. We better go replace those in our warehouse because now our inventories are low. So there's a lot of technologies that really indicate this in a manufacturing and operational point of view.
Yes, and going back to the KPIs on your suppliers, there's a fundamental change that I see in all industries as of today, and is that switch from purchasing a product. So you purchase the software, you purchase the sensor, and that's it, you monitor, to purchasing a service.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of just purchasing the software and having to purchase a new software 2 years from now, you see it with Windows. So now Windows 365 is not a system that you will buy Windows 366. No, the system you pay an annual fee and you keep getting the upgrades to that system, and you keep getting the service.
Yeah.
So there's a fundamental change there in which now your suppliers of parts are providing you with the software that is a complete service agreement.
Yeah.
So it's that switch. It's not just a product. It comes with the whole package.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of leads into this next one with these systems and documentation, right? So now you're starting to see CMMS systems that aren't just the old school way of you put it into the computer, somebody managed that data, somebody had the parts hierarchy put in, and you went and pulled a work order, or you pulled a whatever you had in your systems and the operations to do that work. Now you're starting to see that integration of that knowledge of those systems and being sort of a service to the industry.
Correct.
It's a great example of that. So getting to the end of it, I want to wrap it up just real quick and sort of some of the conclusions, and then we'll sort of open it up for questions and conversations. I know Adrian and I have been bouncing things back and forth, and just to sort of run through these, to sort of wrap up this whole thing is where I see the industry, it's sort of what I see and have lived and worked through is that, we're really not in a position to really move into that direction, because we've sort of been sort of the old school. This is the way we've always done it. We're going to keep doing it. So we really have to move our industry into that the next level of that integration of that. We're starting to get there. We're starting to see the Industry 4.0 with the newer facilities. They're more implementing the hierarchies and the part management and those sorts of things. Again, some of the areas to focus on is product, technology, logistics, data integration, organization, and human resources. And on the surface, it's really easy to sort of say, yeah, that's 4.0, I get it. But it really boils down to that if you don't get it and adapt it within yours, the competition is. The newer facilities, even some of the older operations are really starting to move in this direction. So from a competitive point of view, really got to be starting to think about this. And then lastly here is that a classification hierarchy, and some of that really got to be sure you really get the fundamentals correct and done with that. Adrian, anything else you want to add to that?
I would just add that this Industry 4.0 allows for increased traceability on every aspect of the business, not only parts, not only maintenance, not only quality, but where your product ends up, how long it lasts, when it was produced, and you can understand if your product is still performing well in the field 25 years from now, you should be able to go back and understand what happened that day in which you manufactured that product that made it last for so long.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a key element that I see playing out in the next few years.
Yeah. I guess this last side is just sort of some closing thoughts and arguments, and I'll leave that up here for us to just sort of read through as you guys think about questions. Chris, is there anything in the chat, or open it up for questions for the group?
Yeah, we've got several, so I'll start out and go through them. And we certainly encourage everyone to submit more or raise your hand or unmute and you can ask your question yourself. You kind of touched on the first one already, but I'll go through it. Forest products industry is also not proactive and very reactive. Would love to know what you think. When business is good, the industry does not want to take any risks. But when business is down, industry again does not want to take any risk. When should they take those risks?
The answer is yes.
Exactly.
So I can't tell you the number of conversations I've had here of recent months with, lumber will take, $1,000 price out at that price is just astronomical, and it's not healthy for the industry. Maybe it's just me. I recognize that we can't sustain that price level. There's going to be a correction. That's an unhealthy price escalation. That is a fear pricing. However, 6, 8, 10, 12 months ago, had you implemented some programs that could have helped you through the pandemic and getting your people on board, you could have capitulated on that one. So the question is, when is it the right time to take on risk? My answer was yes, and it is. This is not something that's a once and done. It's a continual improvement into your operations. You're always learning in those high production, high volume cells. And if you can capitalize on getting that throughput done, it's great. And you go to specialty products, it's even more important in specialty products because those things have such uniqueness to them. So it's absolutely important to do that. Adrian, anything you want to add to that one?
Well, I will add just one thing, and you're absolutely right. The right time is yes, and I will say when the business is doing good, it's the right time to actually think about what upgrades you need. When the business is down and when you're at a higher risk, you tend to make more decisions out of stress, and you usually don't make the correct decision. So you end up making the situation even worse. Justin, you see it a lot in projects. When a project is late and you throw more resources at it, what does it do to the project?
Just makes it later.
It makes it later, exactly. So it's just something to keep in mind. If the business already had some projects in mind that kept pushing back and there were solid projects from the beginning, they probably still be solid projects when the business is down. So it will be the right time to also implement them. But usually when you don't have something in mind and you want to look into it, is when the business is doing good.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I've got 4 more, Justin, so I'm going to try to keep us moving. How do you see Industry 4.0 playing a role in moving the forest products industry towards integrated plants such as biorefinery?
So biorefining, my work within the biorefinery side of things is it tends to fall closer to what I see in our chemical industry and chemical manufacturing operations, which with the biorefining, there's just a more, I'll say, management of change procedures in that, which becomes even more important for data collection and management of those parts. So in some of those industries, I see it much more prevalent. So to really drive that, I think what's going to happen is those types of processes lend themselves much easier than, say, a big board plant. The age infrastructure is newer, so they're able to implement newer technologies. Adrian, how about you?
I will say, I will add to that, and we already touched on this, but traceability of your product throughout the facility, before getting to your facility and after when it's installed in the field. I mean, we all know, how difficult it is to recall something once it's installed in the field. So understanding and providing that information to your suppliers, to your inside your plant as well, and to your customers is going to be critical.
Yeah. Hope I answered that question.
How do you recommend companies get started? More sensors, invest in big data analytics, replace outdated equipment with automation, et cetera? How do they take the first bite of this?
So the first bite, I'm going to make an assumption, is they probably have some maintenance program in place. They probably have some CMS program in place. And so I would just really start with that. And then as you can start with that, there are some very easy things to do with Excel that really highlights how these things can do. So it's really an individual that takes passion in that. And it's really about the accountability of that one. So there are several programs on the market that are specialized in this. But I'd say it really starts with having that foundation of the maintenance, the hierarchy, the part structure we talk about, the CMS systems, the predictive maintenance and management systems. Generally, most of our operations have really good QA/QC, really good process controls, and now it's really trying to look for the links between your process and the maintenance to really bring the whole thing together. And it starts with just that simple Excel spreadsheets, and then as you get visibility into the leadership of that team and that organization, it's demonstrating the value of showing how AI can move into the future with that. That's where I would start and build the case for it.
Yes, and I would agree 100% with that. And it's a basic understanding and a basic traceability of what you have installed in the plant, how it works, and all the changes that have been taking place once that equipment is up and running and has been optimized.
Mm-hmm.
And last one, and I think this is very timely, given where we are with the workforce and the job openings that we have. But Scott says, please talk about the workforce issues. Young people are worried about entering the industry, as many have heard it's a dying industry, dangerous, etc. Couple that with news about replacing people with automation, and it gets even harder.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's a great comment, Scott. I just, you know, and this is where I really get passionate about the industry is what I think we have done as an industry is really ourselves a disservice is that we've always been fairly closed. Think about a guy who comes out of a computer science or programming class at Berkeley. He's going to go into the Silicon Valley and he's going to hook up with some startup company. He's going to be programming an app that puts, I don't know, a smiley face on a dog, right? I mean, he's doing some widget programming on an app. That's probably not as fulfilling as saying, hey, come be a part of a renewable energy resource and help program and optimize our resources here and do something cool that's going to save the earth. Yeah, okay, maybe we're not going to save the world, but you know, it's a whole lot cooler to be influencing your passions around the sustainability of our wood products and programming and doing computer simulations and things of that nature than just saying like, yeah, I'm developing an app that puts a hat on a dog or something, right? It's really about how we sell our industry to those individuals. And that's, to me, where I talk about the challenges that we face. And this bottom one here is our industry are so complex and they're different than this like digital world that we're starting to see. So if you think about like our industry is very slow to move things in, but you think about like the Silicon Valley and startup companies there from a digital part of view, you know, our industry is pretty slow. The technology companies move super fast. We're pretty deliberate in how we move, and we don't like a lot of risk. Going back to that last earlier question about risk, we just don't like it. Take a startup company out of the Silicon Valley, right? They're super agile, and they take on risk in a whole different way of thinking than we do. That attracts the young people that have those computer skills, those technology skills, that different level of workforce that we have to bring into our operations. You see that in skilled labor as well as the you know, tradesmen and the craftspeople, right? They like working on the cool cars. You know, there's things like that. We have to be more open and apparent about how our industry is doing that. And I think it's really about messaging. At least for us here at Evergreen, we attract a lot of our top talent that way by giving them and exposing them to that. You know, structural engineers want to design really big, cool structures, right? Well, have you been to an OSB facility, an MDF facility? Have you seen some of these towers that we build, these beams that we do? They're pretty massive. Okay, yeah, they're not, you know, architecturally very pretty, but they're pretty complex. So exposing them to some of the real design is how we attract those young talent. Our PLC programming group, right? We got computer scientists that want to do programming, right? Where do they want to go do, you know, app development, or do you guys want to build programs that operate these massive machines? I think that's how we attract that workforce. Adrian touched on it earlier. You know, you see a changing demographics in the workforce. I think the pandemic and the coronavirus has accelerated that issue for us. I think there's personal belief is that there's people within that late baby boomers who have had, gotten to the coronavirus and just said, I don't think I want to go back in the workforce. I'm comfortable where I am. That knowledge is not coming back. And so we have to be able to bring people in. We have to be able to bring in new, younger talent, and that talent's not looking to do it the same way we used to do it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right on. I mean, you shut down a facility for 3 weeks or a month, and then you decide, okay, well, we're going to start back up, and all of a sudden you find that the person you had for 30 years had said, you know what, it's been a good road. I think I'm done, and all that knowledge is being lost. I think a lot of the Industry 4.0 programs will have that attractive factor for the younger population. And I will argue that is not a dying industry. I do not see it as a dying industry. It might be a really rough environment in some aspects. And I think one of the issues that it faces is you have your facilities closer to your resources. So they are in rural areas. So how can you recruit for those areas? That's the biggest challenge that I could see. And when you recruit for those areas and you understand, well, there are skills that I need these operators and this workforce to be trained on, and a lot of that plays on with Industry 4.0. I mean, we've seen it now in a lot of maintenance training. We're moving towards augmented reality to improve the way you train, and that could play a key part in capturing that talent.
Absolutely. Well, anything else, Chris, in the chat? Any other questions from the group?
That's all we've got. If anybody would like to unmute and turn your camera on and let us see something other than that black screen, you're welcome to join in and post a question.
How are we doing on time? I haven't looked at the clock.
We are
Right on time.
We are right on time. Yeah.
Yep.
It's about time to wrap it up.
Good.
Yep. So with that, I would say if we can segue this back to FPS, we're trying to convert to FPS 2.0 and embrace some of this new stuff. So this type of webinar is a new type of programming that we're trying to bring as we look for ways to connect folks within the industry. Stay tuned for what I think will be a very exciting announcement this fall about renewed interest in technical interest groups that we hope will be a way to build community around specific topics in the industry, and look to host meetings and virtual events like this around specific topics. So thank you to Justin and Adrian. Very thought-provoking conversation today. Thank you to everyone that was able to join us. Look for our announcements via email on the next webinar. And you can also learn more at forestprod.org. So with that, that'll conclude today's presentation. And thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Bye.